In 1972, an entire choir of 18 students vanished mid-song during their spring recital. Their parents watched from the audience. 1 second they were there. The next, the stage was empty. No flash, no sound, just gone. 51 years later, Meredith, a retired music teacher, finds an unlabeled cassette in the town archives. When she plays it, she hears the choir's final note, completed. And after it fades, a voice whispers, "Can we come home now?" Hit subscribe for more strange disappearances, haunted cold cases, and reality-bending investigations. Because every case starts with what's missing and ends with what was never supposed to be found. The spring of 1972 was supposed to be different for Millfield Regional High School. The choir had never been better. 18 voices that blended like they'd been born to sing together. Cassie Blackwood, the youngest soprano at just 17, had earned the solo in Pachelbel's canon. Her sister Meredith sat in the third row, having driven down from the State College just to hear her sing. The auditorium was packed tight. Parents clutched programs printed on cream-colored paper. Mothers dabbed their eyes before the music even started. And fathers shifted uncomfortably in suits they only wore to church and school functions. Mrs. Thorne raised her baton, and 200 people fell silent at once. Cassie could see her parents in the audience. Her mother's hand pressed to her heart, her father's weathered face soft with pride he rarely showed. The opening notes rose like morning light breaking through winter clouds. Cassie's voice joined the others, 18 voices becoming one perfect sound that seemed to lift the very air in that old auditorium. Tommy Brennan, the baritone, stood beside her with his voice rich and steady as bedrock. Lucy Fairchild, the shy alto who'd finally found her confidence in the harmony. Ben Carver, the bass whose notes seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. Susie Torino with her bright second soprano. Bobby Hale anchoring the tenor section. Annie Dufresne whose voice could make you cry without trying. All of them young and alive and full of dreams that stretched beyond the borders of Millfield. But as they moved into the final passage, something felt different. The acoustics in that old auditorium had always been strange. Echoes in corners that shouldn't echo, sounds that carried too far or not far enough. Tonight, though, the music seemed to hang in the air longer than physics allowed. Mrs. Thorne's baton wavered slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing as if she were listening for something beyond the harmony. Some of the students exchanged glances, feeling it too. A heaviness in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. The final note approached, a sustained harmony that would ring for 8 full counts before dissolving into applause and proud tears. Cassie drew in her breath, feeling the others do the same. 18 young voices preparing to create something beautiful together, something that would echo in their memories for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Thorne's baton rose for the crescendo. The voices opened. The sound never finished. Meredith blinked hard, certain her eyes were lying. The stage was empty. 18 white choir robes lay in perfect arrangement where her sister and the other students had been standing heartbeats before. Mrs. Thorne stood alone at the podium, her baton still raised, her mouth open in a silent scream that would haunt Millfield for decades. The incomplete note hung in the air like a question that would never be answered. In the audience, parents began to stand, their programs fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. Someone called out, "Tommy!" his mother's voice cracking with panic. Then Cassie, then Lucy, but the stage remained empty, and that unfinished note seemed to echo in the terrible silence, waiting for voices that would never return. 51 years later, Meredith Blackwood sat in the basement of the Millfield Historical Society, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes that smelled of dust and decades of small-town secrets. The town council had finally decided to digitize their archives, and somehow she'd volunteered for the job, though she couldn't quite remember making that decision. Her arthritic fingers worked slowly through recorded town meetings, school board sessions, and holiday programs that no one would ever listen to again. She'd been at this for 3 weeks now, and the work felt like penance. After Cassie disappeared, Meredith had never gone back to teaching music. The sight of young faces arranged in rows, the sound of children's voices raised in song. It all brought back that night when 18 teenagers had simply ceased to exist. She'd never married, never had children of her own. Instead, she'd taken a job at the county assessor's office, spending 40 years cataloging property records and avoiding anything that might remind her of what she'd lost. The next box contained tapes from 1972. Their labels faded to brown smudges. Meredith's hands went still. She'd been dreading this moment, but there was no one else to do the work. Most people her age had moved away or died, and the younger folks in town treated the choir disappearance like an old wives' tale, something that had probably been exaggerated over the years. She lifted the first cassette with trembling fingers. The plastic case was cracked, held together with yellowed Scotch tape that looked like it had been applied hastily, maybe in secret. She slid it into the old player and pressed the warn button, expecting static or silence. Instead, her sister's voice filled the basement. 17 years old forever, warming up with scales that floated through the dusty air like the ghosts they'd become. Meredith's hand flew to the stop button, but something made her freeze. Cassie's voice continued, joined by Tommy and the others, practicing their harmonies for what would be their final performance. It was a rehearsal recording, probably made the week before the recital. Mrs. Thorne's clipped voice cut through occasionally. Sopranos, breathe from your diaphragm. Tenors, you're rushing. Tears came without warning, 51 years of them all at once. Cassie had been so alive in those final weeks, so excited about graduation and the music scholarship she'd earned to Berkeley. She'd talked constantly about studying composition, about writing songs that would make people feel the way music made her feel. All those dreams had vanished with her voice, leaving nothing but silence and questions that had no answers. The rehearsal tape ended, and Meredith sat in the sudden quiet, her chest tight with grief that felt as fresh as it had the night it happened. She reached for the next tape, her hands steadier now. If she was going to remember, she might as well remember everything. This cassette was different. The case looked new, pristine, as if it had never been played. There was something unsettling about its perfection, sitting there among all the other deteriorating artifacts. She turned it over in her hands, looking for labels or markings, but found nothing except, wait, there, scratched into the plastic so faintly she'd almost missed it. For Meredith, when you're ready. Her blood went cold. Someone had made this tape specifically for her. Someone who knew she would be here, in this basement, going through these archives decades later. Someone who had been waiting for her to be ready for whatever was recorded on this impossible cassette. She slid it into the machine with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the simple task. The play button felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She pressed it and waited. Static filled the air, then silence so absolute it felt like being buried alive. Just as she was about to give up, she heard it, the opening notes of Pachelbel's canon, but not from the rehearsal. This was different. This was the performance. The final performance that had never been completed. 18 voices rose in perfect harmony, exactly as she remembered. Cassie's solo soared above the others, pure and heartbreaking. Tommy's baritone provided the foundation. Lucy's alto wove through the middle like silver thread. All of them were there. Every voice she'd grown up hearing in church pews and school hallways and family gatherings. The music built toward the moment when everything had changed, when 18 teenagers had vanished into nothing. But this time, something impossible happened. The final note didn't cut off. The voices opened in perfect unison, sustaining that last harmony for the full 8 counts before fading into silence. It was exactly what the performance should have been. But that wasn't the part that made Meredith's blood turn to ice. After the applause should have started, after the parents should have been cheering and crying with pride, she heard a whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakably her sister's voice. Can we come home now? Meredith ripped the tape from the machine like it was on fire. Her hands shook as she stared at the innocent-looking cassette, its plastic case now warm to the touch despite the cool basement air. She set it on the table and backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to hurt. The whisper echoed in her mind, Cassie's voice exactly as it had sounded at 17. Can we come home now? As if they were somewhere else, somewhere far away, and had been waiting all these years for permission to return. But return from where? And how could a tape that shouldn't exist contain voices of people who had vanished without a trace? She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of hoax, a cruel joke played by someone with too much time and too little conscience. But the voices were too perfect, too precise. She'd grown up listening to Cassie sing in the car, in the shower, humming while she did homework. She knew every inflection, every breath, every tiny imperfection that made her sister's voice unique. The voice on the tape was absolutely, unmistakably Cassie's, which meant either someone had access to recording technology that shouldn't exist, or her sister was somehow still alive somewhere, still 17, still singing. The thought was too painful to hold on to for long. Meredith had spent 51 years grieving, accepting her sister's death even without a body to bury. The idea that Cassie might have been alive all this time, trapped somewhere, waiting, it was unbearable. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Cassie's face as it had been that final evening, eager, excited, completely unaware she was about to disappear forever. At 3 a.m., Meredith gave up and drove to Millfield Regional High. The building looked different in the darkness, older and more menacing than it had in daylight. But it was the same basic structure where her sister had vanished, and maybe if she stood in that space again, she could make sense of what was happening. The main entrance was locked, but Meredith remembered the side door near the music room that had a broken latch. It was still broken 40 years later, a small oversight that let her slip inside like a ghost returning to haunt familiar halls. The auditorium doors were newer than she remembered, but they opened with the same soft sigh. Inside, emergency lighting cast long shadows across rows of empty seats. The stage stood at the front like an altar, unchanged despite decades of renovations. This was where Cassie had been standing when she disappeared. This exact spot. Meredith climbed the steps slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The stage floor showed decades of wear from countless performances, but as she looked closer, she noticed something strange. In 18 specific spots, the wood looked different, cleaner, newer, as if those patches had been protected from normal damage. She knelt where Cassie had been standing and ran her fingers across the smooth planks. The wood was warm beneath her palm, warmer than it should have been in the unheated building. And as she pressed her hand flat against the floor, she could swear she felt something. A faint vibration, like music still resonating in the grain itself. "You came back." Meredith spun around, her heart nearly stopping. A woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hall lights. Elderly, thin, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "Mrs. Thorne." Meredith's voice came out as a whisper. The old woman stepped into the auditorium, moving slowly but with purpose. She'd aged decades since Meredith had last seen her, but her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. "I wondered when you'd find your way here. Took you longer than I expected. I don't understand." Mrs. Thorne approached the stage, her cane tapping against the floor with each step. "Don't you? You found the tape, didn't you? The one that was meant for you." Meredith's blood chilled. "You know about the tape?" "I made the tape." Mrs. Thorne's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "Well, not made exactly, but I preserved it. Kept it safe until you were ready to hear it." "That's impossible. No one was allowed to record that night." Mrs. Thorne laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Official recording, no. But the building itself, that's different. This auditorium has been capturing voices for 100 years, storing them in its walls and floorboards and the very air between the rafters. Some buildings are like that, especially ones built on significant ground." She reached the edge of the stage and looked up at Meredith with eyes that held too many secrets. "Did you know this auditorium was built on the foundation of the old Methodist church? The one that burned in 1923 with 60 people trapped inside during Christmas Eve service? They were singing Silent Night when the fire started. Some say you can still hear them on quiet nights." Meredith felt the floor shift beneath her feet, though she knew it was only her perception changing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your sister and her friends aren't the first voices this place has claimed, and they won't be the last." Mrs. Thorne's expression softened slightly. But they might be the first ones who get to go home, if someone who loves them is brave enough to help. As if summoned by her words, something glinted on the stage floor near Meredith's feet. She bent and picked up a small silver button, tarnished with age but unmistakably from a choir robe, the kind they'd worn that night in 1972. "How is this here?" she asked, holding up the button. "They leave things sometimes," Mrs. Thorne said quietly. "Little pieces of themselves, to remind us they're still waiting, still hoping someone will finish what we started." Mrs. Thorne climbed the stage steps with painful slowness, her arthritic hands gripping the rail. Up close, she looked every one of her 90-some years, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Meredith think of banked coals ready to ignite. "You want to know what really happened that night?" the old woman said. "It wasn't a question. You want to know why 18 children vanished and never came back. Tell me." Mrs. Thorne lowered herself onto the piano bench with a soft grunt of pain. "It wasn't supposed to happen. At least not the way it did. Your sister was special, Meredith. More musical than anyone I'd taught in 40 years. But she was also desperate. Desperate how? To keep them all together. To preserve something beautiful before the world could ruin it." Mrs. Thorne's fingers found the piano keys, pressing them softly without making sound. "You have to understand what was happening to those children. Tommy's father had already told him he couldn't go to music school, that he needed to stay and work at the mill. Lucy was pregnant. Didn't know it yet, but I could see the signs. Ben's family was moving to California that summer whether he liked it or not." Meredith felt something cold settle in her stomach. Cassie never mentioned any of this, because she was trying to hold them together, trying to convince them all that music was worth fighting for, that they could make something of themselves if they just didn't give up. Mrs. Thorne's voice grew softer, sadder. "She came to me 3 weeks before the recital, asked me if there was a way to make a moment last forever." "What did you tell her?" "I told her what any reasonable adult would tell a 17-year-old girl with impossible dreams. I said moments pass. That's what makes them precious." Mrs. Thorne looked up from the keys, meeting Meredith's eyes. But I could see I hadn't convinced her. She had that look, the same look I'd seen in other gifted students over the years. The ones who burned too bright, who couldn't accept that the world might not make room for their talents. The old woman stood and walked to center stage, moving to the exact spot where she'd been conducting that night. "After our conversation, I started noticing changes in the choir. They were more focused during rehearsals, more intense. And Cassie was asking strange questions about acoustics, about resonance, about whether sound could be captured and preserved in physical materials." "What kind of questions?" "Technical things. The frequency at which certain notes vibrated. Whether sustained tones could create harmonic interference patterns. Things a high school student shouldn't know about unless she'd been doing serious research." Mrs. Thorne turned in a slow circle, taking in the empty auditorium. "I should have realized she was planning something, but I was 63 years old and tired, and I wanted to believe she was just curious about the science of music." Meredith clutched the silver button tighter. "What happened that night? What did she do?" Mrs. Thorne was quiet for a long moment, her face pale in the emergency lighting. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She found a way to suspend the moment, to trap all 18 voices in that final note, preserving them in the space between 1 second and the next. I felt it happening, the air pressure changed, the acoustics went wrong, and suddenly they were elsewhere, still singing, but not in our reality anymore." "That's impossible." "Is it? You heard the tape, Meredith. You heard them complete a song that was never finished. How do you explain that with your reasonable, rational mind?" Meredith had no answer. The evidence was right there in her pocket. The cassette that shouldn't exist, containing voices that should have been silenced 51 years ago. "The thing is," Mrs. Thorne continued, "I don't think Cassie understood what she was doing. She thought she was saving them, preserving something beautiful. But what she actually did was trap them. They've been caught in that moment ever since, unable to move forward, unable to rest." "How do you know all this?" Mrs. Thorne smiled sadly. Because I've been hearing them. Every year on the anniversary, I come back here and listen. Their voices get a little fainter each time, a little more desperate. They're running out of strength, Meredith. After 51 years, they're finally fading. The old woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper. This was on my podium the morning after they disappeared. The custodian found it when he came to clean up. Meredith unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was covered in Cassie's handwriting, but the words made her blood run cold. Mrs. T, if you're reading this, it worked. We found the space between the notes, the place where music lives when it's not being sung. We can be perfect here, forever young, forever together. Don't let them seal the auditorium. Don't let them forget us. Someone will come eventually who can hear us properly. Someone who loves us enough to help us come home. Tell Meredith I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye. See, Meredith's legs gave out. She sank to the stage floor, the note clutched in her shaking hands. She knew. She planned this. Not the disappearance itself, Mrs. Thorne said gently. But she was experimenting with something she didn't understand. Something that went further than she intended. How do I get them back? You can't. Not back to life, that ship sailed 51 years ago. But you can set them free. You can complete what they started and let them move on to whatever comes next. Mrs. Thorne knelt beside Meredith, her old bones creaking. The final note was never finished properly. It was interrupted by their disappearance, leaving them trapped in an incomplete moment. Someone who loves them has to sing it through to its natural conclusion. Someone has to let them go. Meredith looked around the empty auditorium, imagining 18 teenage voices echoing in the darkness. How do you know it will work? I don't, Mrs. Thorne admitted. But I know they're in pain. I know they're tired of waiting. And I know your sister trusted you more than anyone else in the world. The old woman struggled to her feet and headed toward the exit. The choice is yours, Meredith. You can pretend you never found that tape, never heard their voices calling for home. Or you can do what Cassie's note asked. Help them complete their song. She paused at the auditorium doors. But whatever you decide, decide quickly. Each year they get weaker, more faded. This might be the last chance they have. Meredith spent the next day at the Millfield Public Library, digging through newspaper archives and town records that hadn't been digitized yet. If Cassie had been researching acoustic phenomena and harmonic resonance, there had to be traces of her investigation somewhere. The librarian, Dolores Kimberly, was helpful but seemed nervous whenever Meredith mentioned the 1972 disappearance. That's not something folks around here like to talk about, Dolores said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty library. Bad for tourism, you know? Makes the town seem cursed or haunted or some such nonsense. But Meredith persisted, and eventually Dolores led her to a back room filled with filing cabinets and storage boxes that smelled of old paper and forgotten secrets. These are the request logs going back to the 60s, she explained, pulling out a thick ledger. If your sister was doing research here, it would be documented. The logbook revealed a pattern that made Meredith's stomach clench. Starting in February 1972, Cassie's name appeared regularly, requesting increasingly esoteric materials. Harmonic resonance in architectural spaces, February 15, acoustic properties of historic buildings, February 28, sound preservation in natural materials, March 7, frequency manipulation and temporal displacement, March 21, group consciousness and collective disappearances, April 3, the physics of dimensional barriers, April 18th. The final entry was dated just 3 days before the recital, accessing parallel realities through sustained harmonic frequencies. She photocopied everything, Dolores said quietly, took stacks of papers home. I asked her what it was for, and she said it was an independent study project on the relationship between music and physics. But she seemed fevered about it, like someone with a deadline she couldn't miss. Meredith stared at the log entries, seeing her sister's increasingly desperate research laid out in black and white. Do you remember anything else about that time? Dolores glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. There was something strange. About a week before the recital, Cassie came in asking about the history of the high school auditorium. Specifically, she wanted to know about the Methodist church that used to be on that site. Mrs. Thorne mentioned the church fire. 60 people died, Christmas Eve 1923. They were trapped when the exits got blocked by falling timber. The whole congregation was singing Silent Night when it started. You can imagine how that song sounds to older folks around here. Dolores shuddered. But here's the thing Cassie was really interested in. The survivors reported hearing the singing continue for hours after the fire was put out, even after they knew everyone inside was dead. Meredith felt pieces clicking together in her mind. Voices preserved in the building materials. That's what she said. Asked me if I thought it was possible for sound to be stored somehow in wood and stone. I told her I didn't know, but she seemed convinced it was true. That evening, Meredith returned to the high school with the cassette tape and a small portable player. Principal Aldrich had given her permission to visit the auditorium after hours, partly out of sympathy and partly because the school was hoping she might donate something for their planned memorial display. The building felt different at night. Older, more alive with memories and unfinished business. She made her way to the auditorium and settled into the same seat she'd occupied that terrible night in 1972. Third row center. The view of the stage was exactly as she remembered. She placed the cassette player on the armrest and inserted the tape, but didn't press play immediately. Instead, she sat in the silence and tried to imagine what Cassie had been thinking in those final weeks. Desperate to keep her friends together, terrified of the compromises and disappointments that waited after graduation. Young enough to believe in impossible solutions, talented enough to think she might actually find one. The girl Meredith remembered had been passionate about everything. Music, books, social justice, the environment. She threw herself completely into whatever captured her interest, staying up all night to finish projects that other students would have rushed through. If she'd become convinced that her choir family was about to be scattered by the practical realities of adult life, she would have moved heaven and earth to prevent it, even if it meant moving them somewhere else entirely. Meredith pressed play. This time, the recording was different. It started with the familiar opening of Pachelbel's canon, but as the music progressed, she began to hear things that hadn't been there before. Whispers between the notes. Fragments of conversation that seemed to be happening simultaneously with the performance. Are you sure this will work? Trust me. We'll be together forever. What about our families? They'll understand eventually, when they see how beautiful it is. The voices were young, excited, completely unaware of what they were agreeing to. Meredith recognized Tommy's voice, Lucy's nervous giggle, Ben's deeper tones. They'd known. Cassie had told them what she was planning, and they'd gone along with it because they trusted her, because they loved her. The music built toward the final note, and this time Meredith heard something that made her heart break. Just before the voices opened for that last sustained harmony, she heard Cassie whisper, "I love you all. This is for us." The note completed perfectly, 8 full counts of pure, transcendent harmony. But now Meredith understood what she was hearing. Not just the completion of a song, but the sound of 18 souls stepping out of time, preserving themselves in a moment that would last forever. After the music faded, the whispers came again. Fainter now, more desperate. "Can we come home now? We want to see our families. Cassie, please, we're tired. How long have we been here? Someone help us." And beneath it all, her sister's voice, broken with guilt and longing. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it would be like this. I thought we'd be happy." The next morning, Meredith drove to the Millfield Cemetery, looking for graves from 1923. She found them in the older section, a cluster of headstones bearing the same date, December 24th. 60 people, ranging in age from 3 months to 87 years. An entire congregation snuffed out in a single night. Among the graves, she found a larger monument with an inscription that made her blood run cold. In memory of the Millfield Methodist Church fire victims. Their voices were silenced, but their song continues. Below the inscription, someone had carved musical notes. The opening bars of Silent Night. Beautiful memorial, isn't it? Meredith turned to find an elderly man watching her from a few graves away. He was thin and bent with age, but his eyes were clear and sharp. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met," she said. "Edgar Hale. Bobby was my grandson." Meredith's breath caught. Bobby Hale had been one of the 18, a tenor with a sweet voice and a shy smile. "Mr. Hale, I know who you are. You're Cassie's sister. The one who didn't go that night." His voice held no accusation, only sadness. "I've been waiting for you to come around, asking questions." "You have." Edgar gestured toward the church fire memorial. "My great-grandmother was here that Christmas Eve. She was one of the last ones out before the exits got blocked. Used to tell stories about it when I was a boy. How the singing kept going long after the fire was out. How you could hear voices in the wind for months afterward." He moved closer, his cane tapping against the frozen ground. "She said the church was built on an old Abenaki sacred site. The tribe used to come here for vision quests trying to contact the spirit world. My great-grandmother thought that's why the voices got trapped. The land already had one foot in the other world." Meredith felt pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. What happened when they built the school? Used the same foundation stones from the old church. Cheaper that way, and most folks thought it was respectful, like keeping something sacred alive. Edgar laughed bitterly. Guess they never considered what they might be keeping alive. He pulled a folded photograph from his coat pocket and handed it to her. It showed a young man in a choir robe, grinning at the camera with joy and confidence. "That's Bobby the week before the recital. Happiest I'd ever seen him. He'd just gotten accepted to the music program at UVM. "I'm sorry," Meredith said, though the words felt inadequate. "Are you? Or are you here because you think you can do something about it?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "I don't know what you mean." Edgar studied her face for a long moment. "My grandson visits me in dreams sometimes. Still 17, still wearing that white robe. He tells me they're stuck somewhere between here and there, waiting for someone to finish what your sister started." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small silver button, identical to the one Meredith had found on the stage. "Found this on Bobby's gravestone last week. Still warm to the touch. They're trying to tell us something, aren't they?" Meredith nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "Then you'd better figure out what it is," Edgar said gently. "Because I'm 86 years old, and I don't want to die knowing my grandson is still trapped in some god-awful limbo because of a teenage girl's good intentions." That afternoon, Meredith returned to the Historical Society basement, but this time she wasn't alone. She'd convinced Vera Cray, the town's unofficial historian, to help her search through the oldest records. Vera was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and one of the few people in Millfield who remembered the church fire stories firsthand. "My mother was friends with Edgar's great-grandmother," Vera explained as they dug through boxes of century-old documents. "Used to say the woman was never quite right after the fire. Always claimed she could hear singing when there was nobody around." They found what they were looking for in a box marked 1923 to 1925 Town Council minutes. The discussion about rebuilding on the church site had been contentious, with several council members expressing concerns about disturbing the dead and awakening things better left sleeping. But the deciding factor had been money. The foundation stones were already there, solid and well-built. Using them would save the town thousands of dollars they didn't have. "Look at this," Vera said, pointing to a handwritten addendum at the bottom of one page. "From the contractor who did the work." The note was brief but chilling. "Workers report strange acoustics during construction. Sounds of singing, especially at dawn and dusk. Recommend blessing of completed building before occupancy." "Was it blessed?" Meredith asked. Vera flipped through several pages. "Doesn't look like it." The new pastor was apparently concerned about acknowledging superstition and refused to perform any ceremony. So the school had been built on sacred ground, using stones that had witnessed tragedy, without any spiritual protection. A perfect trap for voices that didn't know how to rest. As they packed up the documents, Vera touched Meredith's arm gently. "What are you planning to do with all this information?" "I'm not sure yet," Well, whatever it is, do it soon. This town has been carrying the weight of too many unfinished stories. It's time somebody brought one of them to an end. That night, Meredith couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard whispers. Not just Cassie's voice, but all 18 of them, calling out across 51 years of separation. She finally gave up at 2 a.m. and drove to the high school, using her now familiar side entrance to slip into the building. The auditorium felt different. The air was thicker, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. As she walked down the center aisle, she noticed that the emergency lighting seemed dimmer than before, as if something were absorbing the light itself. She climbed onto the stage and set up the cassette player in the exact center, where Mrs. Thorne's podium had been that night. But before she could press play, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps, soft but definitely there, coming from somewhere behind the closed curtains. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the space. The footsteps stopped. Meredith reached for the curtain rope and pulled, revealing the back area of the stage. It was empty, but on the floor were 18 sets of wet footprints, as if someone had been walking through morning dew. The prints led in a circle, then stopped abruptly in the center where nothing stood but empty air. She backed away, her heart hammering, and pressed play on the cassette. This time, the voices were stronger. Not just Cassie and the others singing Pachelbel's canon, but talking, laughing, whispering to each other as if they were right there in the room with her. She could hear Tommy joking with Ben about his voice cracking on the high notes. Lucy asking Annie if her robe looked okay. Susie humming scales under her breath to warm up. They sounded so alive, so present, that Meredith found herself looking around the stage expecting to see them materialize from the shadows. "Cassie," she whispered, "are you here?" The playback stopped abruptly, even though she hadn't touched the controls. In the sudden silence, she heard her sister's voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere above her head. "Meredith? Is that really you?" She looked up toward the fly gallery, the narrow walkway above the stage where lighting equipment was mounted. Nothing visible, but the voice came again, closer now. "We've been waiting so long. We knew someone would come eventually, someone who could hear us properly. Where are you?" Meredith's voice cracked with emotion. "We're here. We're always here. But we're also elsewhere." Suspended between the last note and the applause that never came. More voices joined in, overlapping, creating a ghostly chorus that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The moment stretched too long. "We can't move forward. Can't go back. Trapped in the music. Help us finish it." Meredith sank to her knees on the warm stage floor, overwhelmed by 51 years of grief and hope and desperate love. "I don't know how." Cassie's voice came clearer now, as if she were standing right beside her. "The same way we started it. With love. With intention. With the belief that music can transform reality. But I'm not a singer like you were. I don't have your voice. You don't need my voice, sister. You need your heart. The note has to be completed by someone who loves us enough to let us go." The temperature in the auditorium dropped suddenly, and Meredith's breath began to mist in the air. But it wasn't cold exactly. More like the space was making room for something else, something that existed at a different frequency than normal reality. "When?" she asked. "Soon. We're getting weaker. Each year we fade a little more. This might be our last chance." The voices began to fade, but before they disappeared entirely, Meredith heard something that broke her heart. All 18 of them, together, singing the opening bars of Amazing Grace, the song their mother used to sing them to sleep with when they were children. When silence returned, she was alone on the stage with the cassette player and the lingering warmth of voices that shouldn't exist but somehow, impossibly, did. 3 days later, on the 51st anniversary of the disappearance, Meredith returned to the auditorium with everything she'd gathered. The cassette tape, Mrs. Thorne's note, the silver buttons, and a heart full of love and terror in equal measure. The building felt different from the moment she entered. The air hummed with potential energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Every step she took seemed to echo longer than it should, as if the sound were being stretched through dimensions she couldn't perceive. She'd invited Mrs. Thorne to be there, but the old woman had declined. "This is between you and them," she'd said. "I was their teacher, but your family. Family is what calls souls home." Edgar Hale had offered to come, along with several other relatives of the missing students, but Meredith had turned them down. She couldn't bear the thought of failing in front of people who'd been grieving as long as she had. The auditorium doors opened at her touch, though she was certain she'd heard them lock behind the custodial staff hours earlier. Inside, the emergency lighting seemed brighter, more focused, as if the building itself were preparing for something important. She walked to the stage and set up the cassette player in the center, then stood where Cassie had been standing that night. The wood beneath her feet was noticeably warm now, almost hot, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. At exactly 7:43 p.m., the moment the choir had begun their performance 51 years ago, she pressed play. The music began, but this time it filled the entire auditorium with a richness and depth that no cassette player should have been able to produce. It was as if the building's acoustics had been transformed, optimized for something beyond normal sound reproduction. As Pachelbel's canon progressed, Meredith began to see them. Faint at first, like heat shimmer on summer asphalt, but growing more solid with each passing measure. 18 figures in white choir robes, arranged exactly as they had been that night. Tommy with his steady, reliable presence. Lucy with her shy smile and nervous fidgeting. Ben tall and serious. Annie bright and irrepressible. Bobby quiet but intensely focused. And Cassie, center stage, her face radiant with the same joy and confidence Meredith remembered from their childhood. But there was something else in her expression now. Regret, and a weariness that spoke of decades spent in a place between places. The figures weren't quite solid, but they weren't mere phantoms either. They existed in that liminal space between memory and reality, sustained by love and trapped by good intentions gone wrong. As the music built toward the final passage, Cassie turned to look directly at Meredith. Her lips moved, but her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We're ready now. We understand what we have to do." "What do you mean?" "We have to sing it through together. All of us. You take my part, and we'll provide the harmony. But when the note ends, you have to let us go. No matter how much it hurts, you have to release us." Meredith nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." The other choir members turned to face her as well, their young faces serene but determined. They'd been 17 and 18 when they'd made the choice to step outside of time. Now, 51 years later, they were ready to face whatever came next. The final phrase approached. Meredith took a deep breath and opened her voice, joining with 17 ghosts in a harmony that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. Her voice wasn't trained like theirs had been, wasn't pure or perfect, but it was full of love and longing and the weight of 5 decades spent missing her sister. The note swelled, sustained, perfect in its imperfection. 1 count, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then, for the first time in 51 years, Meredith let it fade. As the final note dissolved into silence, the temperature in the auditorium shifted. Not colder, but different, as if a door had opened between worlds, allowing something that had been trapped to finally move freely. The 18 figures began to change. Their choir robes faded from white to gold, then to something that wasn't quite color at all but pure light. Their faces, young and beautiful and unmarked by the years they'd lost, filled with a peace Meredith had never seen in life. Cassie stepped forward, her form becoming more translucent with each movement. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades contemplating the consequences of a single, desperate choice. "Thank you, sister. We've been waiting so long for someone who loved us enough to set us free. Where will you go?" Cassie smiled, the same radiant expression she'd worn as a child on Christmas morning. "Forward. Finally forward. We don't know what comes next, but it has to be better than being stuck in the same moment forever." The other voices joined in, overlapping in a chorus of gratitude and farewell. "Tell our families we're okay. Tell them we're not lost anymore. Tell them the music was beautiful, even if it couldn't last. Tell them we love them. Tell them goodbye." One by one, they began to fade. Tommy gave a small salute, the gesture so perfectly him that Meredith laughed through her tears. Lucy blew a kiss toward the audience seats where her parents had been sitting that night. Ben nodded solemnly, still the responsible older brother even in death. They faded in the order they'd been standing, leaving Cassie for last. "I'm sorry," her sister whispered as her form grew fainter. "I thought I was saving us all. I didn't understand what forever really meant." "You were 17, Meredith said. "You were scared and in love and trying to do something impossible. I forgive you. We all forgive you." Cassie's smile was brilliant, transformative. "I love you, Meredith. Take care of the music for us. Keep the songs alive." And then she was gone, dissolving into light and warmth and the memory of perfect harmony. The auditorium fell silent. Not the heavy, expectant silence it had held for 51 years, but the clean, empty silence of a room finally at peace. The stage floor cooled beneath Meredith's feet. The emergency lighting returned to its normal, utilitarian brightness. She was alone, but for the first time since 1972, she didn't feel abandoned. Meredith ejected the cassette tape and found it had changed. The plastic case was no longer warm. The faint scratched message, "For Meredith, when you're ready," had disappeared completely. It was just an empty tape now, its impossible contents erased by the completion of the song it had carried across 5 decades. She gathered her things slowly, reluctant to leave the space where she'd finally said goodbye to her sister. As she headed toward the exit, something on the stage caught her eye. 18 white rose petals, arranged in a perfect circle where the choir had been standing. Not roses, just petals, as if 18 flowers had opened one last time before fading naturally. She picked up the petal from Cassie's position and pressed it between the pages of her wallet, a tangible reminder of a song finally completed. Outside, the night air felt different, cleaner somehow, as if a storm had passed and left the world washed new. Meredith drove home through empty streets, feeling lighter than she had in decades. The guilt that had shadowed her for 51 years was gone. The incomplete melody that had haunted her dreams was finally resolved. The next morning, she woke to find a message on her answering machine. Edgar Hale's voice, trembling with emotion. "Meredith, I don't know what you did last night, but Bobby came to me in a dream. He looked free, happy. He said to tell you thank you, and to tell you they're all together wherever they are now. Still singing, but not trapped anymore. I wanted you to know." Similar calls came throughout the day. Lucy's younger sister, who'd moved to Portland decades ago, called to say she'd felt a sudden sense of peace wash over her the night before. Tommy's nephew mentioned that his grandfather had finally stopped setting an extra place at Thanksgiving dinner, something he'd done every year since 1972. Mrs. Thorne visited that afternoon, looking frilier than ever but with something like relief in her ancient eyes. "It's done then," she said. "It wasn't a question. It's done. Good. I was beginning to think I'd die without seeing them released." The old woman settled into Meredith's kitchen chair with a soft sigh. "The auditorium feels different already. Quieter. More like a normal place where normal things happen." "What will you do now?" Meredith asked. "Rest, I think. I've been carrying those children's voices for 51 years. It'll be strange not to hear them anymore." Mrs. Thorne smiled. "But good strange. They were never meant to stay so long." That evening, Meredith walked through downtown Millfield for the first time in years. The town looked the same. Small businesses struggling to stay afloat, young people leaving for bigger cities, old people holding on to memories of better times. But something felt different, lighter, as if a weight the entire community had been carrying without realizing it had finally been lifted. She passed the music store where Cassie used to buy sheet music, the diner where the choir kids would gather after rehearsals, the park where they'd sometimes practice on warm afternoons. All those places still held memories, but they were good memories now, unmarked by the shadow of unfinished business. At the cemetery, she visited the memorial for the Methodist Church fire victims. Someone, she suspected it was Edgar Hale, had left fresh flowers on the grave marker. White roses, 18 of them arranged in a perfect circle. She knelt and added Cassie's pedal to the memorial, pressing it gently into the earth at the base of the stone. A small offering from one tragedy to another, a recognition that some sorrows take generations to heal. 3 months later, Meredith did something she hadn't done in 51 years. She accepted a job teaching music. Not at the high school. She wasn't ready for that yet, might never be. But at the elementary school, working with children too young to know about choir disappearances and impossible recordings. They sang simple songs, off-key and enthusiastic, their voices bright with the kind of joy that doesn't worry about tomorrow. Her first student was a 7-year-old girl named Emma Torrance, whose mother had moved to Millfield to escape an abusive relationship. Emma was shy, traumatized, barely willing to speak above a whisper, but she hummed constantly under her breath, little melodies that seemed to come from some deep, untouchable place inside her. "She's always done that," her mother explained during their first meeting. Even when things were bad at home, she'd hum these songs, like she was keeping something safe inside herself. Meredith understood. Music had been Cassie's refuge too, the place she retreated when the world felt too harsh or unpredictable, the place she tried to preserve forever, not understanding that some things are only beautiful because they're temporary. Working with Emma, Meredith began to remember why she'd wanted to teach music in the first place. It wasn't about perfection or performance or achieving some impossible standard. It was about giving children a way to express what couldn't be said in words, a language for feelings too big or complex for ordinary communication. Over the months that followed, her classes grew. Word spread that there was a music teacher in Millfield who understood shy children, who could coax songs out of the most reluctant voices. Parents brought her kids who'd been labeled difficult or troubled, children who couldn't sit still in regular classrooms, but could find focus in harmony and rhythm. She never talked about the night in the auditorium, never mentioned the cassette tape or her sister's final message. But sometimes, when her students were singing together, their young voices blending in imperfect but heartfelt harmony, she could swear she heard an echo of 18 voices that had learned, too late, the difference between preserving a moment and destroying it. One afternoon in late spring, almost exactly a year after the release, Meredith was walking past the high school when she heard singing coming from the auditorium. Not ghostly voices or impossible recordings, but the current choir rehearsing for their spring concert. They were performing Pachelbel's canon. She slipped inside and sat in the back, listening to 24 young voices tackle the same piece that had claimed her sister and 17 friends. They weren't as good as the 1972 choir had been. Few groups were. Their timing was slightly off, their blend imperfect, their emotional connection to the music still developing. But they sang it through to the end. All the way through, without interruption or disappearance or tragedy. The final note rang out for its complete 8 counts, then faded naturally into applause from parents and friends who would go home that night with new memories, untainted by loss. As Meredith left the auditorium, she noticed something that made her smile. On the stage floor, in the 18 spots where the wood had stayed mysteriously clean for 5 decades, there were now normal scuff marks and wear patterns. The building had finally let go of its vigil, finally allowed itself to be just a place where music happened rather than a monument to music interrupted. That night, she sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about Cassie's final words, "Keep the songs alive." She'd spent 51 years trying to forget her sister's voice, trying to silence the music that reminded her of what she'd lost. But maybe that had been the wrong approach. Maybe keeping the songs alive didn't mean preserving them unchanged, trapped in perfect moments that could never be repeated. Maybe it meant letting them grow and change and find new voices, generation after generation. Her phone rang. Emma Torrance's mother, calling to say that her daughter had sung a solo at school that day, the first time she'd ever volunteered to perform in front of others. She said her music teacher told her that songs want to be shared. The woman explained, her voice thick with gratitude, that keeping them inside makes both the song and the singer sad. After hanging up, Meredith walked to her bedroom closet and pulled out a cardboard box she hadn't opened in decades. Inside were Cassie's sheet music, her journals, recordings of her practicing at home. All the musical artifacts Meredith had been too heartbroken to look at but too guilty to throw away. She carried the box to her piano, also untouched for 51 years, and opened the bench to find her own music. Her arrangements, her compositions, the songs she'd been writing before grief silenced her creative voice. Maybe it was time to let the music out again. Not to preserve it in some impossible eternal moment, but to let it live and breathe and change and eventually fade, the way all beautiful things were meant to do. She sat down at the piano and began to play, her fingers stiff and uncertain after decades of silence. The melody that emerged wasn't perfect. Too many missed notes, too much rust in the mechanism. But it was alive, present, flowing forward into whatever came next. Outside her window, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns. Somewhere in the vast spaces between earth and heaven, 18 voices sang in harmony with the music of the spheres, finally free to move with the rhythm of the universe rather than fighting against it. And in a small house in a small town, a woman who had spent 51 years afraid of music finally understood her sister's last gift. Not the preservation of a perfect moment, but the courage to create new ones, knowing they would end, loving them anyway. The song continued,